In the realm of the Athlon hierarchy, the Arrow's BTR Gen 2 HD comes in towards the top. The only thing that are higher than this are the Aries Gen 2 and the Chronos, which is something that I really need to get my hands on because people compare that to the Razer HD Gen 2. While as people have compared this Aries BTR Gen 2 HD to a more reasonable PST Gen 2 5-25. You will see what these two look like head to head and the pros and cons of each. Before we get to that though, this is around an $800 rifle scope. It's got some pretty good specs, but not the most amount of features. For $800, I was expecting this to have a little bit more than what it's got, especially considering that this thing is in the prime sights of a lot of very stiff competition. So, could this mildly set up scope really keep up with the best that there is out there? Well, let's find out. The box is standard Athlon. There's not a whole lot to it. They're nicely made. They're made out of very thick cardboard. They feel very solid, and they have all of your basic information labeled on the outside like most other rifle scope manufacturers. These are made in China, so don't be expecting this to be made in the Philippines or Japan. The only Athlon option to be made in Japan are the Chronos. Opening up the box and seeing what comes on the inside, there isn't a whole lot. There's the scope itself, and an owner's manual, also a battery for the illumination, and that's about it. The owner's manual is at least fairly well illustrated and laid out. As far as the scope, you can clearly tell it's made in China from underneath, and it's got a decent looking finish, but the controls do look a little similar to their cheaper lineup of optics that don't cost anywhere near as much as the near $800 that this thing costs. So right off the bat, I'm not feeling very confident with it, but hopefully this thing will change my mind. We're going to start off with the weight because weight is very important for a lot of people, and this thing comes in at a fairly svelte 27, 28-ish ounces, which isn't terrible considering that this is a 30mm tubed, 50mm front objective, 4.5 to 27. Now, 28.2 ounces on my scale, so about an ounce heavier than what they claim it is, but the PST Gen 2 5-25 comes in a few ounces heavier. So if you are really worried about a few extra ounces here and there, this might be a better option than at least what the PST comes in at. Starting out at the fast focus eyepiece, and right away you could tell the material that this scope is made out of is not as high-end as some of the other options. It was also brand new in box, so I'm expecting everything to be tight. And that's exactly what the eyepiece is. Basically rock solid. There was zero wiggle that I felt to my fingertips, and turning it in and all the way out was nice, smooth, and consistent, which is all I could really hope for. The magnification ring does have a little throw ramp, but not crazy for your thumb to get at least some sort of purchase on, but a throw lever is going to be required if you plan on running this thing hard. It does have about a 180-degree throw to it, which is standard, but it does feel good. Again, just like the eyepiece, it's rigid, but not hard to turn. It's a good combination of things. Moving on to the illumination control is where this thing starts to lose a little bit for me. It has almost no good texture on the outside, so turning it's really tough. And the detents sort of just like roll in and out. It's not very positive. Inside the battery compartment, you can see we have our standard 3-dimple PCB board and our 6-finger leaf spring on top, which is perfectly fine. I've never had an issue with any of those. As far as what we are seeing with the side parallax, it does go down to a very close 25 yards and goes out to infinity at just about 180-degree sweep. This does have much better texture to it, so it is much easier to grip and adjust, which is very nice. It's also very hard to turn that. The turrets are in mil, because this is a mil scope, but you can buy this in MOA. These are non-locking exposed elevation turrets, so quite similar to what we see with the PST Gen 2. However, the elevation on this thing has a very robust looking zero stop on the inside, which we will be taking a look at soon. As far as the windage, it feels exactly the same as the elevation. It makes the same sound, and the turrets really do feel good on almost every Athlon scope. They have a nice sharp click to them, a nice solid detent, and it's very reassuring. Even on their cheapest scopes, they're still at least pretty good. Despite the fact that the turrets feel good, they still run these really short threaded caps that hold the cap in place. I really wish it was just a little bit longer, but that's me beating a dead horse. As you can see, the zero stop on this thing is very large and solid, super easy to adjust, loosen up some set screws, turn it all the way clockwise, cinch everything back down, and you are good to go. Your zero stop should lock up nice and tight. The splines that the cap meshes up with on the erector also look really nice, and putting the cap back on to your preferred zero is quite easy. So far, this thing doesn't feel as bad as I thought it would. It looks kind of on the cheaper side, and some of the materials and touch points definitely do feel like they're made of a lower quality material, but it does feel pretty solid, all things considered. But let's see what your roughly $800 buys you. The reticle seen in this scope is the APRS5. If you were to buy this scope in MOA, it would be the APLR3. Go figure on their naming. I don't get it. Here at 4.5x, the reticle looks very easy to pick up, at least on this beautiful white piece of paper. Slowly increasing the magnification, and it really does fill out quite nicely. One thing I've noticed with a lot of the Athlon scopes that I've got my hands on over the last couple of months is the reticles do seem to be one of their stronger suits. Perfect case in point, the Helios BTR Gen 2 2-12. The AMHR or the AHMR2 reticle found in that is still one of my favorite MPVO reticles of all time, and I think it will be for a very long time. Illumination does look pretty decent. It does seem like it fills out quite evenly, and it does look pretty solid when the lights go out. I do like that they opted to illuminate the entire reticle, because this being more of a quote-unquote precision style scope, if you are to use this thing in lower light environments, odds are you're probably going to want to hold for a particular shot, so having the entire thing be illuminated was a wise choice. As you can see and very clearly here, Athlon knocked this thing out of the park as far as a good tactile feel to these turrets. In fact, like I said earlier, a lot of their scopes have incredibly good feeling turrets. You can't have a precision rifle scope if it doesn't track properly. The reticle does line up to my paper target flawlessly. It looks absolutely perfect, as if they were made for one another, which is kind of true, they kind of were. Adjusting the side parallax yields a very stable position of the reticle on the target. There is no shifting whatsoever. The same thing as we increase and decrease the magnification. Bringing up to full, you can see we do have some purple and green color fringing when we go past the plane of existence, but let's see how that looks out in a brighter environment, because really dark inside is not the ideal place for it. Doing a mini step test, we line up almost flawlessly to where we are. We're about 1/10 of a mil off on the windage at 4 mils, which really isn't that bad, all things considered. As long as we're in 2/10 on 4 mils on the windage, I'm pretty happy with that. I'm much more curious about the elevation gain. And once we get to the 10 mil mark, you can see that we are basically perfect on the elevation point, but we're favoring that right line by about 1/10 of a mil. Returning it back to 0 goes right back to where we started, and you can see that the bottom part of the reticle at 6 o'clock at 10 mils does look like it favors the right line a little bit, so maybe it's not 100% a fault of the optic itself. Maybe it wasn't 100% clocked by me, but nevertheless, this is still a very good performance. Let's test the glass in a much more realistic environment. Outside last fall, I want to say, this was at our old 30-yard power transformer. Boy, howdy, is it good to see you again, old friend. So far, what we could take away from the scope is it's got good feeling and sounding turrets, tracks very well, and the reticle is fairly well proportioned. Even here at minimum magnification, granted it's a fairly close target, but it's a fairly complicated target, we can still make out a lot of the reticle, which is something I am a huge fan of. Bringing up the magnification to its maximum here, I did previously set the side parallax to roughly where it needed to be, and we are really, really close. That's another thing that the scope does very well at, and something that I noticed. If you were to set the side parallax to 200 yards, if you were to focus at a 200-yard target, it's going to be really, really close to that target distance. Something that a lot of scopes seem to be off of by at least 10 to 15%, if not significantly more. This thing was very consistent at every distance that I tested it at. It's nice to know, though, if you do plan on using this on a rifle and shooting it really, really close, that at least you can get down to its minimum parallax setting of 25 yards with ease. Let's push it now past to our very shadowy 400-yard brick building, where we're going to see how good the contrast of this glass is. I did raise the camera settings on my camera a little bit to make it a little bit brighter because it was getting a little bit too dark, a little bit too quickly. The late fall sun really does drop down hard once it starts to set towards the horizon. I once again set the side parallax to roughly 400 yards before I slowly increase the magnification, but right here, right now, the depth of field on this thing at 4.5x is wonderful. The tree at the very foreground is probably about 10 to 15 feet away from where the lens is, and those power towers out in the distance are around 1,000 yards. So knowing that this thing has basically infinite sharpness at 4.5x is very nice to see, especially considering you could use that reticle if you're focusing on a target that isn't surrounded by a bunch of clutter and mess. The view through the scope is a little bit on the smaller side. You'll get a much better sense of an appreciation of how small it is. I guess you wouldn't really appreciate it, but you'll get a much better sense of how small it is very soon during the comparisons. And as far as the amount of scope body that we see, it really isn't that bad. It's on the upper end of what I'd like to see, but it's definitely not obtrusive like a lot of other scopes that we see. I had to make a very minor adjustment to the side parallax, but very minimal all things considered. And the image that we're left with is pretty good. We do lose what I feel is a lot of contrast. Those bricks really don't pop, and you can tell that there's a little bit of color fringing on the high contrast areas. Beyond that, though, it's pretty decently sharp, but it's not mind-blowing in any way, shape, or form. There's certainly enough information here to count a lot of the bricks that are on the wall, but it's nowhere near as much solid data as some other scopes are capable of producing, especially around this price point. I do think the image is pretty good. I really like how the reticle looks, but I do feel that the glass is being stretched a little bit much at 27x. I back it down to 15x so you can get a much better sense of how good this glass can be in the more medium magnification, and sure as enough, the sun comes out a little bit more, but the colors come alive a lot more. The contrast seems a little bit more solid, and everything just seems to be a little bit better situated. Again, the depth of field in this thing is extremely high. You can see that tree off to the far left at 9 o'clock is around the 250, 300 yard mark. That brick building is around 400, and the trees behind it are around the 600 to 700 yard mark. So another pretty solid point of the depth of field that this scope has. Some people really like a long depth of field, especially on a more generalized sort of optic, because the less you have to adjust the side parallax to make a hit or at least spot a target, the better. But some precision shooters I know for a fact really like a very shallow depth of field, so they could fine tune the target to be the only thing in focus and forget about everything else. Focusing our attention at the 900 yard power tower. The side parallax at this distance was a little off, but again, by a very minor amount. Pulling it way too close, you could see the image definitely takes on a green tint, and putting it right where it needs to be definitely starts to pick up a very strong purple tint to this. Not uncommon for a lot of optics, but with this scope, it just seemed to be a little bit more apparent at 27x. Below 25x, it really starts to get a lot better. And because this is first focal plane, it's not the end of the world, but I'm just nitpicking. I gotta nitpick. It's kind of like the thing that I do. Yeah. As far as the image stability of the scope, at least at 27x, it's pretty solid. The Eyebox does seem pretty tight, but not unusable by any stretch of the imagination. Our minimum exit pupil on this thing is 1.8 millimeter, which is actually kind of mediocre for this magnification range. Usually, a lot of the scopes that I've tested that are a 30x have the same size exit pupil, if not a touch larger. So it's definitely on the smaller side. But bringing it down to 15x, again, the image seems to be much more vibrant and full of life, despite the fact that we're deep into the fall and the colors are sort of all just brown and kind of dying. But the reticle really looks solid here. Again, I just like the overall proportions of this reticle a lot. It's a good mix of everything, and the fact that it's illuminated is also pretty nice, but the illumination is not visible when it is daylight out, so don't expect to be able to use this thing in a very bright environment. But again, this being an HPVO, or a high-powered variable optic, I'm not looking for that or expecting that from almost any manufacturer. Bringing it down to its minimum magnification of 4.5x, and again, our depth of field increases to basically infinity, yes. 30-yard power lines, 900-yard power towers, everything is sharp, clear, and in focus. And guess what? The image stability ain't half bad either, but the Eyebox to this thing does seem a little on the tighter side, despite the fact that the numbers actually aren't bad. Our maximum exit pupil is 11.1 millimeters, which is pretty on par with a lot of the other scopes, but it just doesn't seem to be all that stellar. And I think part of it is that this scope is on the shorter side. It's only 13.8 inches. A lot of the other scopes we're going to be looking at soon are over 14 inches, sometimes 15 inches, and that really does add to the overall capacity of the glass in a working sense. Basically, the longer the scope is, the better the glass is going to look. Think of a telescope, right? The longer your telescope, the higher the magnification, the better it's going to look. At 4.5x with a dynamic Eyebox, you can see we can pull away from it pretty good and push towards it pretty good, but side to side definitely seems a little bit on the weaker side. Illumination is on full here, and it only really starts to get visible around 10x. And over here, it's decent again with the Eyebox. It's not, oh my god, wow, great, but definitely not impossible to get behind. It's a mediocre performance from minimum to maximum magnification. 20x, as seen here, is another perfect case in point of that. This should be a little bit more forgiving than what it is at 20x, but it's not. Considering we still have 7x more to go, I could barely keep the camera centered behind it well enough to be able to look through the scope. And those shadows really do start to flip really quickly. It's not a great performance for what I like. I like a more progressional shadow that creeps up on the side that we're favoring. You favor the right-hand side, and all of a sudden the shadow creeps up on the left-hand side on this thing. And it really does throw me for a loop. I'm not a fan of it at all. But unfortunately, a lot of modern scopes are designed that way. Low light performance is a very important thing on a high-powered variable optic, especially one that has illumination, because why bother having it illumination if you're not going to use this thing in anything other than perfectly bright, clear conditions? It is very clearly late evening. The sun has gone down. The colors do look pretty good at 4.5x, and the brightness coming through it is very reminiscent of what we see inside. Panning up to the sky, you can see there was very little color shift. There's very little darkening to it. It is a little bit darker, but not by a dramatic amount. But again, we're at the best possible chance for this thing to look good in lower light conditions. I'm going to set the illumination off, so this way it doesn't distract us too much, and slowly increase the magnification until we get to our maximum. Let's see if any shadows creep up in those dark areas. And at 27x, it's actually not terrible. But one thing you have to take into consideration, it looks really good on camera because cameras have a fixed f-stop, a fixed iris size. Your eye is anything but fixed. It is dynamic. And the darker it gets outside, the larger your iris is going to get. And when your iris gets a little bit too big, sometimes it can exceed the exit pupil size of the optic, in this case 1.8 millimeter, which is very, very small at the maximum magnification. What that would give you is a really weird shadow picture that you can't seem to correct. And the reason for that is your eye's letting in way more light than what the scope is actually able to produce. Bringing this out to the 1,000-yard house, conditions here were pretty good. We do have some slight mirage to the air. The air was cool. The sun was hot. It's, guess what? One of those things that you might experience in real-world shooting. At 27x with 0 mils of added elevation, the image does look pretty good. We have some pretty strong chromatic aberration on the roof part of the house where that vent is coming out. But overall, the sharpness level and color representation does look pretty decent. With 10 mils of added elevation, we reacquire our window, and you can see that we did lose a fair amount of brightness and a fair amount of sharpness. However, I do make a quick adjustment to the height control on my camera, and as you will see, a lot of those issues get fixed, at least the brightness. Sharpness doesn't seem as sharp as when we had 0 mils dialed in, but it's still not a horrible image. I would say this is definitely on the usable side, and again, it's not really terrible. Finally, getting into the side-by-side comparisons, and we are going to start with this thing's main competitor, or at least I say main competitor. A lot of people claim that the Ares BTR Gen 2 HD is comparable to the PST Gen 2 5-25. They certainly have a lot going for them spec-wise. They're 5-25 versus a 4.5-27, not too far off. 30mm main tubes, sure. 50mm front objectives, absolutely. First focal plane, non-locking turrets. But illumination, side focus, all the regular jazzy stuff. Weight-wise, the PST is a few ounces heavier, but not by enough of a margin where I feel it's going to make or break someone's decision to buy one versus the other. Length-wise, maybe the Ares I already mentioned is 13.8 inches long, whereas the PST is 15.78. It is substantially longer. It is 2 inches longer than the Ares, but that plays to the PST's strengths. Look at the image on the PST here at maximum magnification at 100 yards. Granted, these two were filmed during very different lighting conditions. And yes, the Ares does have a fair level of sharpness here, but the PST is a much more enjoyable experience to get behind and use. Despite the fact that the PST actually has a smaller exit pupil than what the Ares claims to have, 10mm to 2mm with the PST minimum to maximum, and 11.1 to 1.8 with the Ares, I still prefer getting behind the PST. It's not necessarily what the numbers all directly relate to and correlate with one another. It's about the experience getting behind it. And even though the Ares is decent, it's not enjoyable for me to really run. I didn't get enthusiastic about it. I didn't get really excited about it. It was just sort of like a middle-of-the-road scope, and that's sort of where it landed for me. The PST, even though it's much older at this point, I feel is still a little bit more of a cohesive package. It is more expensive. COVID really made these things shoot up in price. They're like around $1,000 again, which is just like, it's a lot of money. And if you're shopping between these two, is it worth that extra potentially $400? As much as I like the PST, I don't think it is. Because the Ares tracked perfectly, the turrets are great. It's got a very nice reticle. I think a little bit easier to pick up than what we see here with the PST. And if we're really splitting hairs, is there enough of a difference on the overall sharpness of the image? Maybe not. Colors, they're both pretty decent. I think the PST edges it out a little bit. But the field of view with the PST is much larger. It is 24.1 feet at the minimum, whereas the Ares is 22.7, despite the fact it is lower magnification at the minimum. At the maximum, you have 3.8 feet with the Ares and 4.8 with the PST. So completely different in that regard. 10% at the minimum and almost 20% at the maximum. Granted, there's a couple of X difference there. It doesn't matter. That's huge. Another thing that's a little bit different is the eye relief. The Ares is 3.9 inches versus the PST's 3.4. So the Ares will be a half inch farther away from your eye to achieve perfect vision. PST's get a little bit closer, but that's also part of the reason why the view through the PST is as large as it is. Another thing that I have to point out, and it's something I've pointed out a lot with the PST Gen 2, is if you have a Razer HD Gen 2, you buy the PST Gen 2 to throw on your trainer and you leave your Razer on your max performance precision rifle. But the same thing can be said for the Ares, because Athlon is very good at keeping all of their lineups very similar as far as overall features, but also the controls and how they're all laid out. So tit for tat, you could do the same thing with both of these optics. Which one would I pick if I had a gun to my head? I'd probably pony up for the PST Gen 2. There's a reason why they're as popular as they are. They've been rock solid for a lot of people over many, many years. Almost every Bagar you see posted on Reddit has a PST Gen 2 on top of it. and for very, very good reason. They are exceptionally good scopes, something I still use frequently, even though I've been thinking about selling it only because I want to buy something a little bit different, maybe something that I like a little bit more, something that offers a little bit more for the money, and maybe something that we're going to take a look at very soon. But between these two, if you're on more of a budget, go with the Aries. If you want to spend a little bit more and maybe get a little bit more of an enjoyable experience, go with the PST. Either which way, they're both decent scopes, but there are a lot of other fish in the sea, so don't get hung up on just these two options. What scope could I possibly want to replace the PST Gen 2 with? Why, it's the Bushnelle Match Pro ED. This thing is so good. So good for the money. They were recently on sale, I want to say for like the mid to high 500s, and I missed buying one by about 20 minutes, and I'm kicking myself in the butt for it. But typically you could find them for around the $700 price point, so really not too far off from what you get with the Athlon. However, there's a lot more going on with the MPED than meets the eye. Not only do you have a little bit chunkier feeling controls, you get locking controls, you get a little bit more magnification. At the top end, it's a 5 to a 30 as opposed to a 4.5 to 27. You have a 34mm main tube as opposed to a 30mm main tube, and a 56mm objective as opposed to a 50. Price point, again, they're very similar to one another. Lengthwise, guess what? The MPED's an inch and a half longer, and it weighs about 4 or so ounces heavier. But the field of view is also, again, much larger as a result of that combination. At the minimum, you have 24.5 feet for the MPED and 22.7 for the Aries. Maximum magnification, again, despite the fact the MPED has more magnification, we have a larger field of view, 4.1 feet versus 3.8. That's a lot to take in, but it's all good stuff. The MPED is one of those scopes that when I first got my hands on it, I was like, could this be better than the XRS3 that I reviewed like a month or two before? I mean, the XRS3 is Bushnelle's flagship model, and I was very disappointed by that scope. Granted, it was a serving size of 1, but I had more than a few people agree with my evaluation of that scope. The MPED, however, blew me away from day one, and the more I think about it, the more I want one. Even just to put it up on my shelf and take it down and throw it in for some comparisons every once in a while. The MPED really is exceptional value for money. The reticle is also supremely nice. I think it's excellent if you want to use your reticle for really holding off for a lot of your shots. And the large view through it, the large field of view, the brightness, the colors, decent contrast on it as well, all really add up for it being an amazing optic. As far as eye relief goes, the Aries is pretty forgiving at 3.9 inches, but guess what? The MPED's right behind it at 3.8 inches. So these are two much more priced appropriate competitors to one another, but both of them offer a lot of different features. Again, the Aries is a little bit slimmer, a little bit shorter, a little bit lighter, but the MPED, I feel, is a much more cohesive package and something that if you do buy, you are going to be pleasantly surprised with. And guess what? If you don't like the image at 30x, because yeah, it might lose a little bit of brightness, it might lose a little bit of sharpness, back it down to 27x and you're going to get an image that's way better than what the Aries can produce. Go down even further and the MPED just pulls ahead. This really is an easy pick for me. It's going to be the MPED. There's no two ways about it. The Aries is decent, but again, it's just missing that second type of cool, that cool factor that you can't really put your finger on, whereas the MPED exudes that in every way, shape, and form. You've seen the MPED on a lot of rifles recently, and again, just like with the PST, for good reason. They're excellent optics, something I've recommended to a lot of people and will continue to do so for a long time. Despite the fact that here, if you're looking at these two images real close side by side, the Aries does look a little bit sharper, but the MPED overall is still the choice for me, and it's the choice that I'm probably going to end up one of these days to use it to compare against everything else because I really do think it's wonderful. My last competitor is going to be a little bit higher upscale as far as price goes, but honestly not too far off from what the PST Gen 2s are going for. I wanted to love this scope, but there were a couple things that were holding me back. The most notable thing is the turret setup. It's got a locking elevation and an exposed non-locking windage, and I just don't get it. I don't get it, Meopta. Why would you do that? Why would you make such a stupid mistake? That's literally the only thing that's holding the scope back from being on my shelf. Despite the fact it has a smaller view looking through it, a little bit more comparable to the Aries, it's still larger by a fair amount. Scope body profile is basically the exact same between these two scopes. Price-wise, the Meopta comes in around $1,000, but beyond that, again, the Meopta is just going to take the cake with the Aries lunch here and just throw it around like a rag doll. 34mm tube with the Meopta as opposed to 30 on the Aries. That could be a pro or con depending on who you are. Magnification is a 530 by 56 as opposed to a 4.5 to 27 by 50. So again, a little bit higher specs there. Price-wise, around $1,000. But if you want to go a little bit upscale, it's only another $300-400 depending on where and when you get it. Lengthwise, again, it's 1.5 inches longer than the Aries, and that definitely plays as one of Meopta's strengths. They are a little bit larger lengthwise, but optically, they do seem really, really stellar. I mean, granted, I'm not max magnification with the Optica 6 right there, but the sharpness that this scope was capable of was very impressive. Weight is probably the biggest factor. The Meopta is about 8 ounces heavier than the Aries, which is pretty significant, but it feels like a much more substantial scope, the most substantial scope out of all the scopes that we've looked at. The controls on the Optica 6 overall are probably the best of all the scopes that we've looked at, with the exception of the windage turret. Again, I don't know why they opted to do that. Someone that I know has said that Meopta has really changed their philosophy on producing stuff since COVID, and I really hope they turn themselves around again because I really like Meopta and what they're capable of producing. So Meopta, if you're listening to this, if you're watching this, I highly doubt you are, but please straighten your stuff out. You could really advance your stuff to being top tier budget killers. The field of view also goes to the Meopta at their maximum magnification. The Meopta is 3.7 feet versus 3.8 feet. But again, the Meopta is going to have 3x more on the top end. On the bottom end, despite the fact that the Meopta is a 5x versus a 4.5, the Meopta is 24.6 feet versus 22.7. There you go. As decent as the image on the Aries can be sharpness-wise, I really do think it can exude a very high level of sharpness and clarity. The Meopta is much better, particularly because it doesn't have any sort of the chromatic aberration issues as the Aries does. Again, part of that's due to the Scotch glass and the slightly longer body to it. As far as the exit pupil, though, the Meopta is actually significantly smaller, 9.5 millimeter to 1.9 millimeter. Again, match that to the 11.1 versus 1.8. So technically, the Aries, at least at the minimum magnification, does have a much larger exit pupil. But on the higher magnification, the Optica is better because it's 1.9 versus 1.8, and it's at 3x more. So the Optica is actually a little bit easier to get behind at the higher magnifications. Eye relief on both of them, 3.9 inches. Exactly the same. So it really just comes down to which one of these is going to fit your budget and which one of these is going to fit your overall motif of what you're trying to build. The Aries can probably be used as that in-between, kind of like tactical hunter role, whereas the Optica is strictly going to be more on the tactical side, just given its overall weight. 9 ounces is nothing to sneeze at. It's a significant amount of weight, but it's still substantially lighter than what you'd find a Razor HD 4.5 to 27 by 56, because guess what? The Razor is 12 ounces heavier than the Meopta, which is it's nutty. It's 21 ounces heavier than the Aries. That's the only reason why I didn't roll in the Razor HD Gen 2, because the Aries can be used on a bit of a crossover platform, whereas the Optica is really on the upper end of the limit, and everything else we looked at is right around that same sort of ballpark. But the Razor is just, it's not even comparable how much heavier it is than the Aries. When my friend sent me this scope to review, he had paid almost $600 for it on Amazon. It was some crazy sale. Before the sale, they were going for almost $1,000. So I filmed with this and reviewed it and played with it and started editing for this with the mindset that these are like around $1,000, and he just got really lucky buying one for super cheap. Well, since I started filming this and cobbling this review together, the price in these have gone down a bit, more than a bit. On Amazon and a couple other retailers, they're like around $700-800, which is about what I thought they were going to be. But right now on EuroOptic, unless they're running some crazy sale, they're under $600. And that changes things a little bit because the PSTs are still going for around $1,000, and all the other scopes that I talked about and compared this thing to are still going for the same prices that those are going for. So this is actually well below a lot of the other options by a couple $100 in some cases. And that's a lot of money. That's not a significant amount of money. Again, when I first got my hands on this and I filmed this very segment, these two scopes were within $100 or so of one another. And at that point, for me, it was the PST all day long. But if you're looking to save a couple $100 brand new, right now from EuroOptic at least, you can save almost $300 going with the Aries over the PST. Sure, the PST definitely has its strong suits. There are a lot of reasons why I would go with that versus the Aries. But overall, from a mechanical standpoint, the Aries is very solid. Sure, it might not have locking turrets, but neither does the PST. Sure, it might have illumination that isn't the brightest, but guess what? When you need to use the illumination, it's more than bright enough. And most of the controls are honestly very good. The turrets are exceptional. The eyepiece, the parallax are all nice and tight. The illumination knob is a little bit on the weaker side, and the magnification ring could really use a larger throw lever. But it tracks perfectly. The reticle was scaled perfectly. The image can be very, very good. Not the best, but again, it's substantially cheaper than everything else that I compared this thing to. So, do I recommend this? It's tough. It's really tough, even with the new lower price point. If that is the brand new price for this thing, there's still a lot of very stiff competition out there. But I would have rolled in a couple of different little setups. But it's not bad. But it's not my favorite Athlon product. Far and away, I'd much rather have the Helios BTR Gen 2 4-20. I think it's a much better setup optic. And it's actually something that I do plan on running on one of my setups in the very near future. The only reason why I didn't roll that into a side-by-side comparison is a 20X might not be exactly what you're looking for. But if you think that you could be swayed to go with a little bit less magnification, absolutely check out my review on that scope because that thing is very, very good. Anyway, with all that being said, a huge thank you to my friend for letting me borrow this for a few months, a year or so ago. Don't mind my cat cleaning herself. I actually should blur that out. But again, thank you very much to him, and thank you all very much for watching. As always, I'll see you again next time. And a huge thank you to my Patreon providers and my Subscribe subscribers. Without you, this truly wouldn't be possible. If you'd like to support my channel but don't want to join either of those, I completely understand. But you could still help by using my affiliate links in the description below and or like, share, and subscribe as always. Again, thank you very much.